Welcome back, America, to Sound Retirement Radio, where we bring you concepts, ideas, and strategies designed to help you achieve clarity, confidence, and freedom as you prepare for and transition through retirement. And now, here is your host, Jason Parker.
America, welcome back to another round of Sound Retirement Radio. You're listening to episode number 478. The title is The Man Who Changed Investing, my conversation with David Booth. I have a great interview lined up with you to discuss David Booth's new book called Stay Calm, Learn to Embrace Uncertainty in Investing in Life. But before we get into this episode, let's start out by renewing our mind. This verse is from Ephesians chapter 6, verse 7. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people. And here's something fun for the family. Investing is the only place where people see a 20% off sale and run out of the store. Why did the student study on the airplane? Because he wanted a higher education. Today, I had the good fortune to interview David Booth. Let me tell you a little bit about him. His modest upbringing in Kansas, from selling newspapers at 8 years old to selling shoes as a teenager, to working on the team that launched the very first index fund, to pioneering what would become known as factor investing. David Booth didn't just witness the financial revolution, he helped lead it. For 5 decades, he bridged the worlds of academic theory and practical investing, collaborating with Nobel laureates to build Dimensional Fund Advisors into a $1 trillion global firm that has really democratized evidence-based investing for millions. Booth earned degrees in economics and business from the University of Kansas, followed by an MBA from the University of Chicago. His Chicago education proved instrumental to his success, leading to a transformative gift to the business school in 2008. The University of Chicago Booth School of Business now bears his name, and the contributions continue to support faculty and their field-defining research. Through his visionary application of financial theory to real-world investing, Booth has established himself as one of the most influential figures in investing, an outsider who challenged Wall Street's conventional wisdom and won. Before I get started, I want to say just a few words about today's conversation. In today's interview, we talked about David's upbringing and some of the influential relationships that helped shape his path. We discussed the science of investing and many of the breakthroughs that he and his colleagues helped to bring from academic research into the real world. Throughout its history, Dimensional Fund Advisors has been associated with 5 Nobel Prize-winning economists, reflecting the firm's deep commitment to evidence-based investing. One of the themes that really stood out to me is David's remarkable optimism about the future. He sees uncertainty not as something to fear, but as the very reason investors have the opportunity to earn higher expected returns. That perspective has profoundly influenced the way I think about investing, and it's a philosophy that we incorporate into the investment strategies we build for families preparing for and transitioning into retirement. If I sound a little excited during today's interview, it's because I am. I've been studying David's work for years, and his investment philosophy has had a tremendous impact on the work we do at Parker Financial. One of the things I admire the most about Mr. Booth is that he wasn't content to simply understand these ideas or teach them. He acted on them. He helped build a company that brought decades of academic research into practical investment solutions for millions of investors around the world. One of the biggest lessons I took away from David's life is that the world isn't changed by people who simply discover great ideas. It's changed by people who have the courage and conviction to act on them. That idea extends far beyond investing, and it's one of the reasons I was so excited to have this conversation. It was truly an honor and a privilege to have David Booth as a guest on Sound Retirement Radio, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. Mr. Booth also has a new book coming out, and I genuinely loved it. It's more than a book about investing. It's the story of how a handful of powerful ideas changed the way that many of us think about investing, while also telling David's own journey, from delivering newspapers as a young man to building one of the most respected investment firms in the world. It's easily one of my favorite investment books, and I highly recommend it. I'll include a link in the show notes where you can order your own copy. And so without any further ado, here's my interview with David Booth. David Booth, welcome to Sound Retirement Radio.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to have you here. I was lucky enough to get a pre-release of this new book that you have coming out, Stay Calm, Learn to Embrace Uncertainty in Investing in Life. Tell me about the title of the book.
Well, actually, once I tell people the title, they start relaxing right away because they think they're worried I'm going to give them a book about how to invest. It's not about that at all. It's how to think about investing and integrating kind of really what's happened over the last 50, 60 years and how it's changed the world and how all the research that's come up over the last 50, 60 years should make people feel more optimistic and feel more confident that they can meet their investment objectives, which is pretty cool.
It's very cool. One of the things I love about your messaging, one of the things I study about the way that you teach is that sense of optimism and how you view investing, and we're going to get into that. But the book is broken into 3 different sections. It kind of tells the origin story and the science of investing, the mindset that's required to stay calm, and then what true wealth means to you. And so I want to explore all of that. I was hoping that we could start out going all the way back to your childhood. There was a point there in the very beginning of the book, you said that your dad had to borrow money to pay the hospital bill.
Yeah.
Tell me about your family and that time in Kansas as a kid.
Well, it was a tough time for the families in Kansas, and my family in particular. My dad had just come back from World War II, and he and my mom had lived through the Great Depression and then World War II. And then they started having a family, and there wasn't much money to go around, but, families really, in those days, really stuck together, and he borrowed money from a cousin, and I was able to get out of the hospital.
Well, thank goodness.
Yeah.
When I was reading about that story, you talk about your very first job being a newspaper boy, delivering newspapers. Tell me about that.
Well, this was in a real small town. It was, even though it was the county seat, so it was the biggest town for miles around. It was about 3,000 people, no stoplights, that kind of town. And so they had a weekly paper, and it sold for a nickel. And you didn't have a route. You just knocked on doors and tried to get people to buy the paper.
Okay, really? And then what would you do with the money?
Well, I saved it I started saving pretty early on. I had a quarter a week allowance. And my sister and I, we would go to the movie theater on Saturday for the matinee. It cost 15 cents, cost a nickel for the popcorn, and I saved a nickel. And then along with the money I made over time, and anytime I got money, my grandmother would always send me a birthday present of $5.15. $5 plus, in those days, sales tax was 3%. So she paid me $5.50.
Well,
so
nice
over time, I saved my money, and then when I was in, I think I was 7th grade, I had enough money. I bought a sport coat.
A sport coat, okay. One of the things I found interesting was that you talked about how your family moved closer to the University of Kansas, so for you to be able to go to school there. Tell me about that.
Well, the biggest cost in education in those days was cost of living, and it turns out I had a scholarship that could big enough to pay for my tuition, but there was a room and board, and that was beyond what my parents with 3 kids could see that they would be able to do. So their solution was pretty slick, pretty clever. Moved to Lawrence, where the University of Kansas is. We could live at home and thereby save a lot of money and make it feasible to go to the University of Kansas.
Yeah, but that's a big deal for your family to move closer to the university. So education was obviously important. As you think about that, was it your mom or your dad that really pushed to make that happen?
I think it was my mom more than my dad. And, it was, as I tell my kids, I never had to sacrifice for my kids as much as my parents had to sacrifice for me. Things like that. And I don't know if you saw in the book, my first car, that came as a big sacrifice. And it ties really into the book, and the last part of the book we'll get into it on what's really true worth. What's important to you? What do you really value? I characterize my parents as being wealthy. They just didn't have much money.
What were they wealthy in?
Family, friends. I remember, like at my dad's funeral, a friend came up and said, here's your dad. He was the finest guy I ever met.
Wow. That's pretty cool. I want to ask you, I do want to ask you about that first car and the story behind it, because there were a couple of stories that you told in your book that kind of sent shivers down my spine. So tell me about the first car that you had.
Well, in college as an undergrad, I didn't have a car or or high school. But living at home, I could use my parents' car, so. Then I got accepted to the University of Chicago into the PhD program. And so my dad said, well, look, we're going to have to get you a car. It'll be used. So, don't get your hopes up too much. But one day coming back from school, I saw in the driveway this red Valiant convertible. I don't know if you remember Valiants. It was kind of a compact car, they called them in those days. A beautiful little car. And of course, I knew what a sacrifice that would be. So I went in and was effusive and thanking them and so forth. So I roll forward about 30 years, and my dad is he had a terminal case of cancer. And so we started talking about a lot of things over the years and getting perspective. And one day he said, do you remember your first car? I said, sure, I remember my first car. I mean, it was a great little Jewel. Yeah, hot. He said, your mom always wanted a red convertible, and I got her one. And then you came in, and you thought it was for you, and your mom just said, let's just let him have it. And he said, she never got it. She never did get a red convertible.
Wow.
Isn't that great?
That is that sacrifice that you're talking about.
Yeah.
That I could see my wife doing the same thing actually for our kids.
Yeah.
I loved that story. What did you learn from that experience 30 years later when your dad told you that?
Well, I mean, I learned obviously what a sacrifice they'd made. And here again, true value, what's really important, true worth. I had another experience with that. Once I got into the PhD program, my second year in the program, I was, on the one hand, I had everything going for me. I was working for Jane Fama and doing a lot of research and frequently staying up all night down at the computer center because you're dealing with punch cards and you you had to program well when you could get time. And so I go down to my paternal grandparents' house for Christmas, and there we had all the relatives, the aunts, uncles, cousins, jammed into this little house. The house didn't have indoor plumbing, so you had an outhouse and, linoleum floors, that sort of thing. And I'm standing there, looking around. I go, hey, these people are really happy. I'm stressed out. Who's the oddball in this group, So what I started to do a lot of self-reflection and eventually decided, I don't think I'm really cut out to be a professor. I mean, because doing this research I was doing, it was a grind for me. I was working for Gene Fama, and for him, he loved it. I mean, he couldn't get enough of it. So I got to find something I really love. And, nobody's applying these ideas that are coming out in terms of, the 60s and to some degree 70s was a period of time when finance emerged as a science. You can't have a science unless you have testable hypotheses. And before 1960, they didn't have the data to test out hypotheses, and didn't have computers big enough. And that all changed in the 60s. And the people at the forefront, really, University of Chicago was one of the places that was really at the forefront of all of this. And if you look at the professors that were at Chicago at the time, I mean, they had a huge influence on the whole industry. And
I know. I mean, these people that we teach about today, you were at school with many of them. I wrote down some of the names. Your roommate was Roger Ibbotson, Merton Miller, Myron Scholes, Kenneth French. Well, Kenneth French, I don't know that he was there.
He was a pup. He was a pup. He was young.
Gene Fama, Mac McQuown, Rex Singfield, Jack Bogle. There was part of your story intertwines with his. Milton Friedman was a professor that you took a class from. I want to get into all this, but one of the things that I want to back up a little bit before you got to the University of Chicago, because as I was reading your story, and I have to tell you, this book, I think people are going to love it. I enjoyed this book so much as I was reading it. I've got it highlighted, and I think it's going to be one of the top books in finance when this comes out next month. But
by the way, thank you about that. I mean, thanks. I mean, a couple of months ago, I was telling people, look, it's like turning in your term paper. I've turned in the book, the publisher, it's going to get printed now, and I have no idea if people are going to like it or not. So thanks for good.
I really enjoyed it. But one of the things you talked about before we got to the University of Chicago was Mrs. McReynolds and the impact that she had on you in terms of encouragement. Will you just share that story real quick? Because I think it also I think that story and the Milton Friedman story kind of go hand in hand. So I want to make sure we're talking about both of them.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, I had this experience in high school. My senior year, I was taking a calculus class from Mrs. McReynolds. And my high school had arranged with the University of Kansas that at the end of the first semester, they would give an exam, and if you got a high enough score, they would actually give you college credit for calculus. And so it came up, and I took the test, and I didn't get a high enough score to get credit.
And you had been sick, right?
Yeah, it actually turns out in my whole life, that was the sickest week I ever had. But you had to take the final that day, or there was no alternative. And so I didn't get the credit, and I was devastated. I'd always taken pride in math, and you know how high school kids are, you know. So I overreacted a little bit and transferred out and said I was going to never take math again, and you know. So I'm sitting in my new class the next semester and the first day and trying to look inconspicuous, hoping nobody will ask me, where were you last semester? And Mrs. McReynolds walks in the door. She had gone to the effort. When she realized I wasn't in the class, she went down to the office and found out where I was and came and found me. And she's standing up at the front of the classroom motioning me to talk to her outside. So I go outside with her, and she just says how badly she feels and that she wants me in the class. And so I said, okay.
But that one decision, that teacher to pursue you, to come out, to recognize that you were really good. You had a bad test because you had a bad day. But boy, one of the things I'm always reminding my kids is life is all about relationships. It's all about, these people that come into our life and the opportunity that we get to walk life with people. But I just think, man, that was a pivotal moment.
Pivotal moment. I mean,
another pivotal moment that I read in your story was the Vietnam draft. Yeah. And I think in order to understand the science that you invented, we have to understand how you got there. So tell us about before you got to the University of Chicago.
Okay.
The Vietnam War is going on, and
yeah, and the way the deal was in my age group was that you could get a student deferment for 4 years. So after you got out of high school, draft board will give you 4 years of student deferment. So after 4 years, when I graduated in '68, took a summer job, just waited to get drafted. And my draft board, for who knows what reason, they made a mistake and they sent me another student deferment. And I leveraged that into another year at KU. And that's when I started studying finance and decided I wanted to be a professor. So it had a big impact. And that's when I got accepted into, the program at Chicago. And
so before the program at Chicago, though, you get this, you find out, you get this good news, you're not going to have to go to Vietnam, which was a huge deal. And you had a professor at the University of Kansas how did your decision to go to Chicago come about? Was it that professor at the University of Kansas that said, I really think you should go to Chicago? Or was that your only selection? Was that the only place you had hoped to go? Or how did it come to be?
Well, yeah, it was, I didn't know what to do. I'm on borrowed time here while I'm in at grad school at Kansas, because I know the draft board's going to come after me, so I'm going to get exposed here. Anyway, so while I was thinking about my future, the deal was after you came back from the service, they had to make you whole in the sense if you had a job, the company had to give you your job back, or if you were in a PhD program and they got drafted, they would have to leave a spot for you when you came back. So I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I interviewed for jobs, and I really enjoyed my finance class, and I had this great finance professor there, and so I said I thought about maybe being a professor. He goes, well, if you're interested in being a professor, you got to go to the University of Chicago. Turns out he'd gone to the University of Chicago. But he also gave me things to read, like Gene Fama's PhD dissertation, which was a landmark. And, you could sense that the world was changing very rapidly. So I read that and applied to Chicago, and I think with his recommendation, and I got in. And then I flunked my draft physical. Now all of a sudden, I'd taken a job with Exxon in New York, and I'd taken a slot in the PhD program. I had to, after flunking my physical, I had to decide, work, go back to school, work, go. I was on a subway ride up to Exxon's offices, and on the way up, I just said, it's now or never with school. So I decided to go back to school.
Wow. So you get to school, and Gene Fama is the first class you take?
Yeah, first class, first day. He outlines his view of the world,
And that really influenced you. I mean, in many ways, it influenced your philosophy of investing, which I want to ask you about in a second, but also created this lifetime friendship. And Gene Fama he's what, 8 years older than you?
Yeah. So I'm 79, he's 87. He still works 6 days a week, maybe 7. He still loves that research activity that was stressful for me is still music to him, It's great to watch.
So I find that so interesting that you guys became friends, though. You became his research assistant there at the University of Chicago, and then he befriends you, he teaches you, you're learning these ideas, and then you come to this realization. So that's where you started talking about, you met with your grandparents, you realized they were happy. You weren't enjoying this PhD program. You had your MBA there from the University of Chicago, and you decide that the PhD program's not for you. And I have to tell you, the courage that it took is one thing, but there's a big difference between researching and teaching versus actually implementing ideas in the real world. And so when you went to Gene Fama and said, "Hey, I want to go actually make things happen," he creates a connection for you. He introduces you to Mac McCown, and you go to work at Wells Fargo. So why in the world would your professor create that connection for you? You guys must have been really close, or how did that relationship come to be?
I ask myself that, why was he so nice to me? I ask myself that all.
That one relation, again, these small relationships really changed the course of your life.
Yeah, so he said, when I said I wanted to leave the program, he goes, well, he talked to me about, what the benefits of staying and being a professor, but I said, no, I just don't want to do it. And he goes, okay, well, I've had this guy out in San Francisco, Mac McCown, who always wanted one of my students. He said, I'll give him a call. So he gave him a call, and then Mac came to Chicago, we had dinner, and then he hired me to go out and work for him in San Francisco. Boom.
And a lot of people may not know this, but Mac was part of the team, and you were on this team that developed the very first index fund. Before Jack Bogle came out with the S&P 500 index, you and Mac and the team at Wells Fargo, you guys were working on the first index fund.
Yeah, it was. See, what had happened by then was, the data had already come in about the futility of active management in the sense of trying to outguess the market, trying to pick stocks and timing markets. That all looked like a losing game. So leading academics they were accepting all of this. But that creates a problem, which is if you're not supposed to try to pick stocks and time markets, how do you invest? Well, that's really been my whole career in some sense. It's really figuring out the science, figuring out the best way to apply the science, and then the best way to execute on whatever it is you come up with. That was going on at Wells Fargo in 1971, and there were two groups working on that. There's the group I worked with, and we used two outside consultants, Fisher Black and Myron Scholes, who, by the way, while working on this project, developed the Black-Scholes option pricing model, for which Myron got the Nobel Prize in '97. And then the other part was the trust department, and there I think some marketing genius had come along and said, "Look, what you really want to do is do an index fund. Managers can't seem to beat the market, but you can index the market, you can track the market." And so that's what the trust department. So we have these two kind of competing groups and we both ended up leaving. Actually, the trust department got sold a few times, is now the cornerstone of BlackRock, which is the largest money management firm, with their iShares, and that all traces back to Wells Fargo in '71. And then the other side, the side I was working on, eventually leads 10 years later to the creation of Dimensional. So we have in '81 then people like Myron and Gene Fama and Merton Miller and Mac McCown and Rex Singfield and Roger Everson would come huddle together and figure out the best way to really create a money management firm. And that's what created Dimensional.
I want to back up just a second, because when you had met with your grandparents and you saw they had a happy life and you realized you didn't want to be a doctor, but you had written this paper and you presented it to Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman was very critical. He kind of dismissed everything you had to say. And that's that contrast between Milton Friedman and that high school Mrs. McReynolds, because Milton Friedman, in some ways, the criticism is what drove you to question whether or not you really wanted to be in the PhD program. So when I read that, I was like, boy, it may have felt like criticism at the time, but had that not happened, Dimensional Funds may not be here today. Dimensional Funds has had a significant impact on so many people's lives. So I just wanted to, I don't know, get your thoughts about that connection there with Milton Friedman.
Well, it turned out it turned out to be a great experience for me and for the business school, because it actually literally was the next day after that presentation. Thinking about it overnight, I realized I wasn't cut out for the PhD program, and that's when I went into Fama's office the very next day. Said it's not for me. And
I mean, sometimes, and I think it gets really to this core of uncertainty and embracing it. Sometimes something happens and it causes life to go a different direction, and that can either be devastating or it can be opportunity in disguise. A good friend of mine likes to say that fear and opportunity feel the same. It's the same. It's a similar emotion. But and just real quickly, before we get into your investment philosophy and kind of some of this work that you've helped to implement and the things you've learned and taught over the years, going back to 1971, Mac and you and the team at Wells Fargo are helping to create the first index fund. You guys end up leaving Wells Fargo. And then Jack Bogle in 1975, he asks for the research from Wells Fargo. Am I understanding this correct? For creating the index fund, the S&P 500 index fund that he started in 1975 then?
Well, yeah, Wells Fargo had wanted to do a retail mutual fund, an S&P 500 fund. But the door was closed to them because of Glass-Steagall, which has since been lifted. So they realized they couldn't do a retail S&P 500 index fund. Then Mac got wind that Jack Bogle was wanting to do an index fund. And so Mac asked the CEO of the bank, what should I do? And the CEO said, and Mac was asking, with all the data we had and all the research we had, the CEO of Wells said, give him the data.
Just give it to him. You didn't sell it to him, just gave it to him.
To give it to him, yeah. It probably, it wasn't worth much, but anyway, that was, back in those days, everybody helped everybody,
That's so cool.
Eventually.
And then the story about how Vanguard actually ended up helping Dimensional with some of the bookkeeping work after you guys started.
Right.
Jack, and you had an opportunity to sit down with Jack Bogle years later before he passed away and thank him for helping Dimensional get off the ground. But what was that? Was that a positive relationship that you had with Jack, or was there much of a relationship? Or?
Well, anybody knows Jack knows that it wasn't a real tight relationship. But what it was is that we decided as we were starting the firm that we wanted to do a mutual fund. And I didn't know anything about running mutual funds. So I went down to Vanguard and asked Jack, I said, why don't you do all the back office stuff? I mean, running a mutual fund is complicated. And I said, why don't you do it for a fee? And he goes, oh, okay. And so they did all the thankless stuff of running administrative stuff, running a mutual fund for about 4 years, and then they decided they didn't want to do it. But by then, we were trained and knew we could take over. And that's why, years later, just before he passed away, I was so happy I was able to say, thanks. I said, Jack, I don't know what we would have done without you, but, you just made it a whole lot easier for us. So thanks. It's nice, as I'm getting ready to turn 80, and that's kind of what I'd like to do now to all my long-term friends is go around and tell them thanks,
That's cool. You talk about your investment philosophy. So will you share your core of your investment philosophy?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's people just naturally gravitate to the idea that the way you want to invest, say in the stock market, is analyze stocks and companies and figure out which ones are good and which ones are bad. and try to pick the good ones, and maybe get into the market, get out when you think, and all of that. That's what everybody grew up with, and that's where the breakthrough really came, when all of a sudden researchers have data. You could research, does that stuff make sense? Does anybody gain from that? I mean, and professional money managers, once you consider their cost, do they do better than just a simple index fund? Those were the questions that came up. And, our reading of it is you're best off of behaving as your professional money manager probably isn't worth the cost. And so you need to find a different way of investing. And the good news is, and really in some ways is kind of my passion right now, is explaining why that's all good news. And there are really two parts to the story. One is this behavior of stock and bond markets. We only deal in publicly traded securities, stocks, bonds, money market funds, that sort of thing. I mean, there's a whole wide range of things you can invest in, but that's what we focus in on. That's what we can really comment on. And now we have 100 years of data. Now, as a researcher, what you're looking for is a good test, a good sample that can give you insights about how to go forward. And, well, now we have 100 years of data. Now, if you think about it, it starts it goes through the Great Depression, World War II, Korean War, the high inflation, low inflation, Great Recession, COVID. And through all of that, stocks have done 10% a year. I don't know how to tell a better story than that. That's as good. So that's part one. Part two is you can buy the market. There are all kinds of market portfolios you can buy very easily and very inexpensively. So there's really no excuse for not investing in the market. I mean, you don't have to worry about being an outsider. You'll do as well as the insiders. How cool is that? So it's really a democratization of this whole investment process, which keeps me excited to understand all of that. It isn't that complicated, I don't think, but it just so conflicts with people's basic intuition that's hard for them to overcome.
On chapter 4 of your book, you wrote this, and I highlighted it. It says, "The restless drive to improve, to solve problems, to make tomorrow better than today, that's human ingenuity. And that's at the core of my investment philosophy, which I describe as science-based hope." And it's one of the things that I think resonates so strongly with me is that when you understand what investing is and what it is not, it changes how you show up in the world. And one of the things you said is when you really get these ideas all the way down into your tippy toes, you just don't understand the science, but you get it down into your tippy toes, it changes how you respond to uncertainty and volatility and what investing is. So what do you have to say about that?
Well, there are a couple of things in there. First is I don't want to leave the subject of ingenuity because that's the core of all of this. But the other thing is, and you're getting at is, and a theme of the book, is dealing with uncertainty. Investing is uncertain and complex, and so is life. So you've gotten here today. Over the years, you've learned how to deal with uncertainty in your life. And if you kind of reflect on the principles that you used to deal with uncertainty, those are a lot of the same principles that we use in dealing with in investing. You can't predict the market, so forget about trying to predict. You can't predict your future either. I mean, you could have predicted 20 years ago where you'd be today, right? So the key to all of this is not predicting. And people understandably shrink away from uncertainty, and yet we can convince them it's really the uncertainty that creates the opportunity in life. If there were no uncertainty, you wouldn't have been able to progress. And in investing, if there were no uncertainty, in other words, investing if everything was riskless, all investments would have the same return, the riskless rate of return. So if we can spend enough time with people, we can convince them that it's not about eliminating uncertainty, it's about managing uncertainty. So predict what you can, or control what you can, and manage what you can't. I mean, it sounds simple, but that's really the premise.
And there's something that's really core to this message that I want to make sure people understand, because you talk about, over 100 years, the market has averaged 10% per year. But more than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle said that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I really think that concept really identifies investing. On page 99 of the book, you said that you talk about uncertainty of the market compared with the uncertainty of any individual investment in the market. Can you tell me what you mean about the individual components versus the whole of the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think when most people, they're worried, when they talk about investing, they're worried about a catastrophe. You know, and if you invest in any one stock, you know, its value can go to zero. I feel comfortable making this prediction. The stock market's not going to zero.
That's a good prediction.
That's the difference. You know, it's about diversification. You can, there are two primary ways you can avoid catastrophes. The first one is just what I outlined. You buy the whole market rather than taking the risk of individual stocks. That's number one. And number two, then you have to decide how much you have in the stock market versus relatively riskless assets. And for some people, they don't want to have much in the stocks. And for younger people, probably they ought to have a lot in stocks. And so those are the two ways we kind of eliminate catastrophe. And, you know, this seems like a simple enough process, but, you know, for most people, it's kind of overwhelming. And what's funny to me, I don't know if it's funny, but, you know, if you have a serious medical issue, you go to a doctor. And everybody has a serious financial issue, and regardless of how much money you have. And so you need professional help generally. As long as you can afford it, people need to work with advisors. And so we don't sell directly to the public. We work with financial advisors, fee-only advisors. And these advisors can help people work through these potentially anxiety-creating questions.
Yeah. Well, you do have the ETFs that are available now, and that's a good option for people that want access to your strategies. A couple of things I want to say there. Number one, you probably remember that 2017 paper by Hendrik Bessembinder, who he said, do stocks really outperform T-bills? And what he found, I think he said the number was like 57% of stocks over a long period of time underperformed T-bills. And it's only like a very small percentage of stocks that outperform, but it's those small percentage of stocks that drive most of the return. And that's where it gets back to this idea. You don't have to be a great stock picker. If you just buy the market, you get to benefit from both. You get to have the winners and the losers. And one of the things I've heard you say before is you avoid extreme outcomes. So you don't have the extreme highs of maybe, buying NVIDIA 15 years ago, but you don't also have the extreme lows of companies going to zero. And that is such an important idea for people to understand. Just this, the sum is greater than the individual parts. One of the things, and I want you, because we talk about indexing, but Dimensional, you guys have a reputation for what I would say is beyond indexing. And you talk about March Madness and how your family likes to wager on the basketball teams every year in terms of who's going to win. And you said that you logically like to pick the higher ranked teams over the lower ranked teams. How does that same logic from March Madness apply to beyond investing? This idea of looking for opportunities to go beyond just buying a market cap weighted index.
Well, I mean, you can try to draw too close a parallel between those two things. You have to keep in mind that, in the big family with all the cousins and grandkids and so forth, usually it's a 12-year-old that wins the pool, or maybe a 10-year-old, So we have all the crusty old adults like me.
With all the wisdom.
I think they know something. Yeah. And, of course, also the worst performers are also those 10 and 12-year-olds too. So they're on the extremes. But you're getting to a point which is, we talk about glibly about this 10% return on stocks over the long haul. Well, you have to be in the market to be assured of getting that return. If you miss out on a few of the key months, you've harmed yourself greatly. And to your point about a few stocks having skyrocketing, it's so important to hold all of them because you want to make sure you get those skyrocketing stocks and they'll pick up all the rest of them. If you are out of those, typically, if you have a stock that just takes off like crazy, one thing you know for sure is it had to be unexpected to the market because the market doesn't set prices, so you get a zillion % return, So if it's unexpected, it's not clear you would have picked it out,
Well, and it kind of brings up this whole topic of artificial intelligence. Like we've had AI now for several years. It's getting better and better all the time. And the question that I would have for anybody is if artificial intelligence can solve the market, like if it can only identify the winners and the biggest winners, why aren't we there now? Why aren't people only buying stocks that only go up?
Well, my mentor, Gene Fama, eventually gets the Nobel Prize in 2013 for his work on efficient markets. And loosely speaking, one way to think about it is that prices reflect all available information. That's the theory. And, if that's true, then professional money managers shouldn't be able to beat the market. So we observe professional money managers don't seem to be able to beat the market. So the efficient market is a pretty good assumption, a reasonable assumption anyway. So if stocks really do reflect all available information, no AI model can do better than that in terms that's all the information, that's all you can use. And so undoubtedly there will be dueling algorithms trying to pick stocks, replacing the old timers with green shade,
They're pocket protectors.
Shades, yeah, right, and all that. So it ought to be, AI ought to make markets even more efficient in my view.
Yeah, and that's one of the things you pointed out too. I've heard you talk about the fact that, indexing has increased significantly in the last 20, 30, 40 years. But the other side of that is active trading has also increased significantly. Why do you suppose that's the case? If all the evidence and all the research shows that buying all of the stocks is better than buying the individual components, why are we still at a place where there's so much active trading happening?
Boy, you've asked, that's a question I ask myself all the time, and I ask other people. How do you explain that? There's been an explosive growth in index funds. Now, if you really thought you could now guess the market, you'd go to a buy and hold strategy. You wouldn't. In index funds, one of their characteristics is relatively low turnover. So if half the market is now indexed, why wouldn't about half the trading volume disappeared? Instead, it's gone twice or many multiples. Here's my guess. Until I hate to make out guesses without data, concrete data, but is that people have given up on stock picking, but they haven't given up on market timing. And index funds are a great timing vehicle. You can get in and out of a market on just, trading one security. So it's perfect for timing. So I think it appeals to all the market timers, and that creates a lot of trading volume. So
one of the things that I think really sets apart the work that you guys have done at your firm is the number of Nobel laureates that have been attracted to Dimensional. I think when I read in the book, there were 5 Nobel laureates that have served on the board of Dimensional. Why do you suppose people in the academic community, as they're helping to shape the vision and the implementation of the strategies, why do you suppose they're attracted to the work that you guys are doing? Because I don't know of any firm that has that kind of deep academic rigor and just attracting like the top minds in finance. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, I think it has historically, go back to my days in the PhD program. We would meet weekly, the finance department and the PhD students, just to review anybody that was working on a paper. You would they call it a finance workshop. So, you kind of meet regularly with all these same people. And, these are superstars, right? And even though they hadn't gotten recognition, this stuff was incredibly important. And so they got to be friends. And then, so the story is that when we decided to start the mutual fund, and Jack Bogle says, well, okay, you're going to need a lawyer. Here's the one I use. And he gave me his name. And so we meet with a lawyer for the fund. He says, you have to have an independent board of directors. No kidding. So we were meeting in Fama's office at the time, and Rex Sinkfield and I walked across the quadrangle to the faculty building for the business school, and we walked in. First person we talked to was Merton Miller, who got his Nobel in 1990. A delightful human being, and one of the funniest people you'll ever come across. He said, Merton, we need an independent director. He goes, oh, yeah, I'd love to help. Because he knew we were on the right side of the argument. We weren't trying to, sell snake oil. We were trying to do the right thing. And so we walked out of his office, and coming the other direction on his way to lunch was Myron Scholes. I go, hey, Myron, we kind of need your help here, independent director. Myron goes, well, how much are we going to get paid? And I go, hey, Myron, we're talking about you being an independent director. It would be unseemly for us to pay you anything. And besides, we don't have any money. But if the fund gets off the ground, you'll get director's fees. And okay. So what's amazing is not that these guys signed up, but they stayed with us forever. I mean, Merton until he died. Myron eventually, he was our lead independent director until he was aged out, the board. And then Bob Merton took Merton Miller's place. He already has his Nobel Prize in '97. He joined us in 2000, and he's still our resident scientist, but he started working too closely with us, so he couldn't be an independent director anymore. And then the most recent was Doug Diamond. I guess a couple of years ago now he got his Nobel. I don't know if I got all of them. Fama, Miller, Scholes, Bob Merton, and then, Doug Diamond. And Doug Diamond, until recently, was the independent director for the fund. So they've not only stayed with us, they've worked. I mean, it hasn't been just lip service. They've been very valuable to the firm, which is why at the end I eventually gave the university a big chunk of what I had, and they named the school after me.
Yeah, that was very generous. I want to talk about some of the way that you show up in the world beyond just finance, but I know you've talked about these topics a lot over the years in terms of your firm is really well known for these factors that you apply to the indexes that you create. But people at Sound Retirement Radio, Sound Retirement Planning, they may not know all of the research that's been done and applied. So will you take just a quick minute and talk about some of these overlays, these characteristics of stocks that you guys help tilt towards and why you would tilt towards them?
Well, it goes back to, let's start with some theory. And I before people groan, I'll get through this pretty quickly. When I was in school, kind of a prevailing risk-return theory was the capital asset pricing model. And what that capital asset pricing model said was that risk is beta, and beta is the relative fluctuations of a stock or portfolio. And if you had a beta of 1, it meant you fluctuated kind of like the market did, up and down with the market. And if you had a higher beta than 1, you would fluctuate more than the market, and you ought to have a higher average return. It was an elegant theory that suffered primarily from the fact that it never described reality. Kind of a drawback. But at the same time, we had Bob Merton that developed this, who's as I mentioned, a resident scientist, in about 1971 or so, developed what's now I think called a multi-factor theory. It said, there can be more than one factor. The capital asset pricing just had one factor, the market. He said there could be multiple factors explaining differences in average return. And that languished as a theory for about 20 years, partly because few people could understand what he was saying. But there was then a huge jolt, a big shock in '92 when Professor Fama, again, along with his colleague Ken French, developed an empirical model that tied into Bob's theoretical model. And the empirical model was a 3-factor model. So in addition to the market, there are 2 other factors that they said could explain differences in average returns. One was size of company, large versus small. And the other one was kind of this growth value, high-price stocks versus low-price stocks. Low-price stocks have higher average returns than high-price stocks. All other things being equal, the riskier
if you buy something cheap, it's going to go up. It has more potential to go up.
The riskier the company, the lower the price it's going to sell for. So that's kind of a risk story. And similarly, smaller companies, there isn't any theory for, but most people accept that they're probably riskier. So those are 2 additional factors. And you take the 3 of them together, and it just did a bang-up job in explaining, rates of return, and gave people optimism about using quantitative methods. And that spawned a whole industry. Now you have, I mean, I don't know, probably over 100 factors, maybe a couple hundred factors that researchers have identified that seem to explain returns. Nearly all of them boil down to those, just a handful. We added profitability, for example, as a factor. So,
and the idea is we're trying to pursue higher expected returns. These
Right.
characteristics of these groupings of stocks have exhibited that, not just in the United States, but international emerging markets. So it continues to show up regardless of where you are in the world. And so as a result, the idea is if we're going to tilt portfolios towards these different factors, the expectation would be that we'd be compensated for them. Sometimes that shows up, sometimes it doesn't. So
Right.
one of the things that people have, been frustrated with maybe in some instances is you can go long periods of time without those factors showing up the way that we would hope they would. So, and I think I heard Gene Fama say that, the more something becomes known, the more people implement it, it can actually diminish some of those expected returns.
well, yeah, if it does, though, of course, you want to be in because the way it would diminish is you'd have a big run up in those factors. That's what would lower the future. But no, I mean, it typically takes a scientist, 30, 40 years to conclude that stocks have a higher average returns than money market funds. Say 30 years, maybe 20 on a good day. So, and these other factors, they all suffer from the same thing. I mean, you can go long periods of time. In fact, when we started the firm, and basically all we had was U.S. small cap, and we happened to start at the beginning of the worst period of relative performance for small stocks. If you look at the 7.5 years ending in 1990, the S&P 500 compounded at 14% a year, and we compounded at 2% a year. That's our firm. We have no track record. This is other than that, this is all we have, and the results are incredibly disappointing. The good news in that is it shows you the power of good ideas. Our sales pitch to people was, we think in forming an equity portfolio, you ought to have stocks of large companies and small. You shouldn't have all your money in large. And in 1981, when we started, big institutional portfolios were absent, small stocks. So this was a very appealing way of getting access to small companies, was our fund. So the good news for us is that by the end of 1990 also, Russell and other people had small company indices. And what they showed was we delivered what we said we were going to do. We delivered what small companies did. It wasn't that we were snookered. It was, in fact, over 45 years, our fund has outperformed benchmarks by over 100 basis points a year, which is hard to believe.
The power of good ideas, like you said.
Yeah, so in other words, or stated differently, the last 35 years have been terrific. But that first 9 was pretty nasty.
I want to shift. I know we're running out of time here. So Elon Musk was recently interviewed on The Economist, and he said that he thinks in 10 years money won't matter and that he envisions radical abundance as a result of AI and humanoid robots. What do you think about that?
I mean, I don't know. He could be. I mean, I doubt if he's right, but and it overlooks one thing you brought up earlier on that we really haven't developed, which was this idea of human ingenuity, which really gets into why have stocks done 10% a year, and I think part of it relies basically on human ingenuity, in that, take an example, the first quarter of 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, COVID hits, market's down 30%. People are pulling their hair out. What do we do? What are we supposed to do? What's going to happen? I go, I don't know what's going to happen. Here's what I believe in, though. Here again, down to my tippy toes, is that people want to make their lives better. And when they go to work at firms, they want to make their firms better. So I don't know what's going to happen, but people aren't going to sit there and take it. They're going to figure out when things go wrong or untoward, people figure out how to get back on track or make life better for themselves. So I don't know what's going to happen, but there'll be new firms springing up, and there'll be new solutions. There'll be winners and losers, and the usual thing we see in markets. And, we might be surprised how quickly the economy gets back on track. And that's what happened. I mean, the recession, I think, was just one quarter. I mean, it was unbelievable. That's human ingenuity in action. And I love particularly the U.S. exceptionalism. Yeah, I don't know what you want to call it, but we got back on faster than most countries, so.
I share your enthusiasm for that optimism. I am always trying to remind people the same thing. Look, businesses are just people who are creating goods and services that make our lives better. And it's hard to imagine a world where we're not going to want better lives, and so why would we bet against human ingenuity? I love that message. I got it from you. Like, that's why I'm always pounding on this drum is, yeah.
Well, good.
I do question, I want to ask you a couple of more personal questions here. One is, when I visited the Dimensional headquarters there in Austin, I stepped into the elevator and the guy that I was with, Ryland, he kind of elbows me and he says, "That's David Booth." And 79 years old and you're still showing up to work. Why aren't you retired?
Well, I tell you, I am retired. I mean, what in the sense that I've changed my job around. I work in the morning and I meet with we have two co-CEOs that are really running the firm now, Dave Butler and Gerard O'Reilly. And I meet with them usually most mornings and then go to lunch with my partner, she's also our art curator. Have lunch with her, then I go home and work out. And hey, look, I'm 7.5 years younger than Gene Fallman. He's still working 6 days a week.
Okay.
Why would I work? I mean,
your friends are doing it. You might as well stick with them.
Well, I mean, that's right. And we still have the passion. People need to understand these concepts you and I have talked about today. These are important concepts. And I'm not giving up, and until the last person that kind of accepts that these ideas make some sense,
Wow. You have been doing a great job of that. You mentioned your partner and art, and you have been very generous to both art museums, to the University of Chicago, the Chicago Booth School of Business, named after you. But I'm really curious because my wife's an artist, so we love art as well. I'm curious to know why you collect art. Like, why do you love it? Not what kind of art you like, but why do you actually enjoy art in the first place? Because for somebody that's so analytical, a mathematician, for this other side of your brain, I'm just curious why that's important to you.
Art, well, first off, I think it is one of the most remarkable things I've learned over time. As you start to, when I got out of school, like most of us, we didn't have really any money. And I remember I had a poster that I'd gotten at MoMA in New York and, with plastic wrapped around it. That was my art in my living room, for years. But as you start to accumulate money and then you start developing, let's say, a portfolio of art, what you realize is, I don't know if art's a good investment or a bad investment, but the ability to enjoy what extra wealth you've been able to accumulate, to be able to enjoy it as much as I do the art. I enjoy it every day. I never get tired of it. If I had a big bag full of silver dollars, I don't think I would particularly enjoy just looking at those silver dollars every day.
Yeah.
So art, it's all the arguments that people usually make. It enables you to think, helps you to think. At the office, I think it tells employees we kind of care about them a bit. And when the clients come in, hopefully think our office is more welcoming than if we didn't have art up. I guess the answer to your question is I don't know why, but I just love it, and I can't imagine not having it.
In your book, you said you like art that makes you happy, that makes you smile, that brings you joy. And I was thinking, because my wife's an art teacher at the local high school here, and she does an art show every year with the kids. And every year she does this competition where we're all supposed to kind of gauge, which piece we like the most. And I remember this one year, there was this kid that had drawn this funny picture of a frog wearing a tie. And that was my favorite piece because it elicited that emotion for me. It just made me smile. I was like, this is so ridiculous and it's so fun that's what I enjoyed. But can I ask you just two more questions?
Sure.
Okay. You were the first portfolio manager at Dimensional. Your role has had to change a lot of times. You guys are managing over $1 trillion in assets now. Obviously, you're not still the guy making the portfolio trades. How has that been a hard, was that hard to go through those different transitions from a leadership standpoint when you were changing your role in the firm?
No, it really wasn't. Let me back up a bit. One of the things that I think I learned really early on was, you have a choice to make. You can either be the big cheese or you get things done. You have to choose. Do you want to be the king, or do you want to have a successful firm? And then with that in mind, then all of a sudden I realized that what my job was in the early years, not now, but in the early years, it was try to figure out what's going to have to get done, and then subtract out what I think is going to get done given the few people we have. And the difference between those two things is what I got to work on. Initially I did all our systems, our first trading system algorithm. I wrote that. I wrote the first prospectus along with the help of the lawyers. I mean, it had all the. I tell people, everybody in the firm, I've had your job, and then as we grew, I could specialize more and more into what I really wanted to do, and as I got older, and now as I've said, what I've done is continue to change my job around, so that I want to come in every day. I mean, that's my advice to people as they're aging and thinking about retirement. Is retirement, it's fine for a lot of people. I've been so lucky that I can change my job around, so I don't want to really not go into the office.
Yeah,
that's a luxury.
That's cool. In the book, you talk about your dad and that opportunity you had before. So there's kind of a very sad story, actually, where your dad, had been an accident. He got out of the car to try to help direct traffic. And then as a pedestrian out trying to help direct traffic, he ends up getting hit and dies. And you have to go share that news with your mom, who was in a nursing home facility due to Alzheimer's or dementia and strokes that she had. But before that, you had a chance to talk to your dad, and you asked him, what were his greatest regrets? And that made me think about the way Stephen Covey asks this question, and this will be my last question for you, which he says in The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he says, you walk into a room, a church, and you walk up, there's a casket in the front of the room, and you sit down in the pew, and for the next hour, you realize that you're in the casket. It's you in the casket. So then you're sitting there, and for the next hour, you're listening to people come up, and they're remembering you and your time. And the questions that I always come back to are, how will you be remembered, and what have you contributed? So as you think about that for you, how would you hope to answer that question?
Well, I mean, I haven't answered the first part. You got to go back to when my dad was in the casket, and this friend of ours came up and said, he's the finest man I ever met. So when I'm sitting there in that casket, I hope we have one person at least. It'd be kind of cool if somebody came up and said that about me. That would be pretty neat. And what I've tried to contribute is being honest with people and trying to work on doing the right thing. And hopefully, I've always had the view when my time is up, I'll be able to look back and think, give or take a bit, the world probably was better for me being here than had I not been here. So, and you have to be careful because, I've been able to give lots of money away and so forth. And my parents were never able to do that, but, I don't know if I've contributed any more than my parents did. So I think about those kinds of things as well. So it's a great question, and I'll go home and think about it a bit more.
I love it. Well, I so appreciate the contribution that you've made to my life. Like I say, I just feel like this opportunity to interview you for this show is so incredibly meaningful to me, because the ideas that you've implemented, that you've studied, that you've researched, that you've helped get out into the world are things that we share with the people that we serve. The book, I think this book is going to be a top seller. Not just a top seller, but I think it's going to make a significant impact in people's lives if they read it. I think for me at least, it's one of the top 3 books that I would recommend to people, because it tells the origin story, it tells the science. I love the vulnerability for you to share kind of your life throughout this, and then the final bit, the bit of wisdom at the very end about what's most important in life. So, thank you for the work that you've done. Thank you for this interview, and boy, I just appreciate you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for tuning in to Sound Retirement Radio. For articles, links, and resources from today's show, visit soundretirementplanning.com. If you enjoy the podcast, share it with a friend and give us a 5-star review. Ready to kickstart your retirement planning? Head over to retirementbudgetcalculator.com. Need assistance with investment management? Explore our services at parker-financial.net. Information and opinions expressed here are believed to be accurate and complete, for general information only, and should not be construed as specific tax, legal, or financial advice for any individual, and does not constitute a solicitation for any securities or insurance products. Please consult with your financial professional before taking action on anything discussed in this program. Parker Financial, its representatives, or its affiliates have no liability for investment decisions or other actions taken or made by you based on the information provided in this program. All insurance-related discussions are subject to the claims-paying ability of the company. Investing involves risk. Jason Parker is the president of Parker Financial, LLC, an independent, fee-based wealth management firm located at 9230 Bayshore Drive Northwest, Suite 201, Silverdale, Washington. For additional information, call 360-337-2701 or visit us online at soundretirementplanning.com.